Hello everyone, I'm Roisin McKee. I'm Project Director with the Hospitality and Tourism Skills Network, HATS for short. I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar on the Northern Ireland labour market as part of our recruitment and retention webinar series that's been brought to you by HATS and supported by Tourism NI. Staffing issues, as we know, continue to be a major concern for the sector, which is a core focus for the work of HATS, which is an employer-led network supported by Invest NI, which brings employers from across the industry together with a collective focus on addressing talent attraction and retention issues in the sector through collaboration with key partners. So as part of our activity, this particular webinar series is being delivered to help businesses in their efforts to recruit and retain a sustainable workforce, but also to support the adoption and implementation of our hospitality and tourism commitment, a voluntary code of conduct which was launched by HATS to improve the attractiveness of hospitality and tourism as a provider of good quality employment and a great place to work. For this session, we're putting the spotlight on the Northern Ireland labour market with an insight into headline labour market trends. And that's to help set the context for employers' recruitment strategies by looking at where the potential labour supply is coming from and the implications for recruitment and indeed retention going forward. So I'm delighted to welcome Marguerite Shannon, who is a senior economist at Ulster University Economic Policy Centre, to deliver this session. Marguerite works within the Centre to develop policy-orientated research with particular interest in skills forecasting, labour market analysis and intelligence and economic impact modelling. Marguerite, I'm delighted that you're able to join us this morning to share that labour market insight, and I'll hand over at this point to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Roisin, and welcome everyone to my presentation today as part of the broader recruitment and retention webinar series that Roisin kindly sort of outlined there. My presentation today is going to focus around the Northern Ireland labour market, looking at some of the headline labour market trends and really what the implications of those trends are for recruitment and retention, particularly within the hospitality and tourism sector. So as Roisin kindly introduced, my name is Marguerite Shannon, and I'm a senior economist in the Ulster University Economic Policy Centre. And I just want to begin by thanking Roisin for inviting me along to present today as part of the wider webinar series. What I want to talk through today then, just to begin and set context, is that some key headline labour market trends. I'll then move on to look at some future labour market supply constraints as we expect to see going forward. I'll follow on with a brief overview of some imbalances taken from the Northern Ireland Skills Barometer that we may see in the future decade, and finish up with looking at, well, what's next for recruitment within the hospitality and tourism sector. So to begin then, some of the headline labour market trends. In terms of current headline labour market trends, the chart here on the left-hand side is looking at the employment rate, and we have the UK level of employment and the Northern Ireland level of employment just below, which is the lighter blue coloured bar. And what I want to do here is really compare the pre-pandemic level of employment with the post-pandemic level of employment, and that allows us to gauge how the labour market is actually recovering from the pandemic. So we can see the initial drop-off in the employment rate as the pandemic hit in January 2020, which of course is expected. We then see some fluctuations, again as expected, as the economy opened and closed over the course of the following 18 months, which the hospitality and tourism sector will be all too well aware of. But what I want to draw your attention to here is in the most recent data, we are starting to see a more sustained rise in the employment rate. And we can see that the employment rate now is somewhere around 71%. It is still below the pre-pandemic 72, 73%, but we are starting to see that employment rate edging upwards, albeit we're about 20,000 workers below our pre-pandemic levels. In the next chart here, I want to show you the unemployment rate. So the reason some of the employment rate hasn't quite returned to the pre-pandemic levels is also associated with constraints across labour availability. So if we look at the unemployment rate, we can see here that, again, post-pandemic, we saw a rise in the unemployment rate, albeit not what was originally expected because many workers were protected by furlough. But it has again started to come down quite considerably in the most recent data. So the unemployment rate is currently sitting at about 2.5%. So that's really quite close to the 2.3% that we've seen pre-pandemic. And that 2.3%, it's also worth noting, was a historic low in the unemployment rate. So returning to that level of unemployment with that level of pace post-pandemic really starts to highlight the tightness of the Northern Ireland labour market and really how constrained that traditional pool of available labour is. Now, if we recall that the unemployment rate, or the people who are unemployed, are defined as individuals who are of course out of work, but they are actively seeking work and they are actively available or readily available to start work within the next couple of weeks. This then leaves a sort of non-traditional pool of labour supply from the economically inactive. The economically inactive differ from the unemployed population in the sense that whilst the unemployed population are out of work, so too are the economically inactive. The unemployed population are actively seeking work and are readily available to start work. The economically inactive population are not actively seeking work in the last 4 weeks, nor are they available to start work in the next 2 weeks. So there's where some of the differences lie between the unemployed population, where they are actively seeking work and readily available to start. The economically inactive population haven't been recently seeking work and are not available to start in the next 2 weeks. However, they do represent a large volume of labour reserves, which become particularly important during periods of labour market tightness. And we can see here that Northern Ireland has the highest rate of economic inactivity across all UK regions at about 27%. So this does represent maybe a more non-traditional pool of labour that, as I say, becomes particularly important during periods of labour market tightness. However, whilst it's the highest rate currently at about 27% across all UK regions, it has also been the highest rate for much of the last 30 years, regardless of the business cycle, whether we're in periods of labour market tightness or not. And that sort of 3-decade trend really begins to highlight the complexities and difficulties associated with mobilising this group of labour or potential labour reserves and mobilising them and moving them closer to labour force participation. So it does represent a group of labour that or potential labour. However, there are complexities there. There are a whole range of different groups of individuals within the economically inactive population that each face different barriers and complex needs to labour force participation. However, I would caveat that by saying the economically inactive population can also sometimes often be misunderstood. Just because these individuals have not been seeking work in the last month or are unavailable to start in the next 2 weeks, it does not mean that they do not want to work. So in Northern Ireland, around 17% of the economically inactive population actually report that they would like to work. Now, because the inactive population is so large, 27% of the total working age population are economically inactive, which typically equates to somewhere in and around 300,000 people. 17% of that group of individuals represents quite a large number. 17% of the inactive population is about 52,000 people. So there are 52,000 people within that inactive population that report they would like to work. So those individuals are a group of individuals that we would suggest are relatively closer to the labour market or quite similar to those individuals who are defined as unemployed. Both of these groups of individuals would like to work. So that is 52,000 people. And the unemployed population is somewhere in the region of 20 to 22,000 people. So quite considerable volumes of people within the inactive population that do report that they would like to work, which is quite important in that it is a more non-traditional pool of labour or potential labour. So that's a very brief high-level overview of the current labour market as it is, and highlighting that tightness within the labour market and really where that tightness is coming from, what's driving it, and what are the mechanisms that are sort of forcing that labour market tightness. There are threats to the current labour market position if we consider the most recent cost of living crisis, which is predominantly being driven by higher energy prices. If that cost of living crisis continues in the absence of any real wage increases, we will start to see consumers struggle to keep up with the same levels of consumption that they have done in the past. If we move into that situation where individuals are unable to keep up their same level of consumption patterns, we will start to see this labour market position threatened. But I do want to just move on now to the question of future labour supply. So the future labour supply faces three key challenges that I want to discuss. So firstly, demographics, in that there are relatively fewer working age people. Secondly, migration, or the uncertainty around migration. We've seen a decline in the levels of migrants since both Brexit and COVID. And finally, then, educational attainment, or increasing educational attainment, and what implications that has over both the short term and the long term. So taking a broad perspective then on the future labour market supply, we can look at demographics. On the chart here, we can see that the working age population, that is those people who are aged between 16 and 64, increased by around 70,000 in the decade to 1990. And what that means is that there were an additional 70,000 individuals added to the prime working age population. That doesn't necessarily translate to 70,000 people being added to the workforce. Many of these people would be unemployed or in full-time education or out of work. But it's a good proxy for understanding how that group of prime potential labour reserves is growing. It then increased by about 80,000 in the decade to 2000 and was up over 100,000 in the decade to 2010. So the working age population was seeing significant growth in the decades from 1990, 2000 and 2010. In the most recent decade to 2020, the growth in the working age population slowed quite substantially to less than 20,000 individuals. And in the coming decade, it's expected to grow by less than 5,000. And this means that there are relatively fewer people entering prime working age in the coming decade than there has been for much of the last 40 years. Slower growth in the working age population is a key contributor to labour market shortages that are both being felt now, as well as are going to continue to be felt over the coming decade, as we can see as this drops off in the forecast for the 2020 to 2030 period. And this idea of the reduction in the reduction in the growth of the working age population is really echoed also by the highly uncertain migrant population, where we can see here the chart on the right-hand side is looking at applications for national insurance numbers by non-UK nationals. So in this chart, we can see that from around 2010 to 2015-16, the number of applications for national insurance numbers by non-UK nationals initially began to grow and sort of began to level out somewhere in the region of 14 to 16,000 new applications per annum. And this is a good indicator for looking at the volume or number of migrants that are coming each year, hoping to work and live in Northern Ireland, represented by applying for a national insurance number. As the Brexit referendum happened, we then started to see the volume of new applicants tail off, dropping down below 14,000 and then down to around 12,000 in 2017, 2018, and 2018-19 and 19-20. This then fell off a cliff edge in 2020-21. Now, that's most predominantly associated with the general lack of movement of people throughout the pandemic period. However, it is a continuation of a trend that was happening since 2017, really, albeit it's much more drastic or much more stark in the most recent data. But for a sector that relies upon migrant labour, it's really not hard to see why they may be struggling to access workers over the last couple of years, but particularly in the last year alone. And we can see that from this one chart alone on the right-hand side. In terms then of sectors that are reliant on migrant labour, looking at the accommodation and food sector, we can see that it's now the most reliant sector on migrant labour in Northern Ireland, with around 16% of the workforce in 2021 non-UK born. This was as high as around 21% before the Brexit referendum and has declined to around 16% in 2021. So accommodation and food is most reliant on migrant labour, and therefore you can begin to see why it's feeling, some sectors feel the pinch of these trends in a reduction in migrants coming to Northern Ireland more than other sectors. For example, accommodation and food is going to feel those labour market shortages that little bit more than maybe the likes of wholesale or retail, or maybe the IT sector. And what we can also see here is, well, manufacturing would have sort of taken the title of being most reliant on manufacturing labour, more or of migrant labour more traditionally. Pre-Brexit, it was about a quarter of their workforce was non-UK born, and that dropped off quite significantly in the last number of years to around 13%, moving accommodation and food services up that reliance chain a little bit more. The final thing I want to speak about in terms of future labour supply is around the increasing levels of educational attainment. So education institutions from post-primary school right through to higher education have been experiencing higher levels of educational attainment for a number of years now. And this is seen as a welcome trend for society in general, as those individuals that are able to improve their educational attainment will typically be awarded with better opportunity, particularly within the labour market. However, whilst we're looking at these trends, we must also recognise the short-term challenges that this creates within the labour market, particularly for sectors that rely on lower level qualifiers. So, and what I mean by that, I'll go through. On the first chart here, we have the proportion of school leavers achieving at least 5 GCSEs, including English and maths. In the most recent data, we can see that 76% of school leavers are achieving 5 GCSEs, including English and maths. That has spiked in the last year, we can see from the chart. However, again, it's a continuation of an already existing trend of improving educational attainment. It's not something new. It's not something that has just happened in the last year. We can see that in the previous 8 years, the levels of educational attainment increased by 16 percentage points. And in the 8 years before that, they increased by 12 percentage points. So it's a continuation of a trend that has already been happening, albeit in the most recent data, we did see a bit more of a spike. The spike is much more stark when we look at the right-hand side chart here, which is the proportion of school leavers achieving 3+ A levels, A star to C, where in around 2003-04 academic year, 27% of school leavers were achieving that level of education. That's now up over half of all school leavers at 52%. Now, what this means then in terms of labour supply really is that if higher educational attainment continues, or the implications of having higher levels of educational attainment means that young people are retained in the education system longer, because they are then provided with an opportunity to progress through to higher levels of qualification. So if you're an individual who's achieved 5 GCSEs, including English and maths, you're then possibly more likely to stay on in education and return to education to complete A levels. That is the the opportunity cost of that being that you're less likely to exit the education system and enter the labour market. So you're adding 2 years on potentially there to your educational journey before entering the labour market. Similarly, if you are awarded 3+ A levels, A star to C, you may be awarded with an opportunity then to go to university. That then adds 3, potentially 4 years onto your educational journey before you exit the education system and enter the labour market. So what we start to see here is the education system retaining young people for longer, meaning that those sectors and those businesses that rely particularly on individuals with lower levels of qualification, the likes of NQF level 2 and below, so your A levels, your GCSEs and below, really starting to feel the pinch of labour market shortages as these young people are retained for that bit longer. Then sort of looking then at the hospitality and tourism sector, or the restaurants and hotels sector, we can see that it is a sector that relies on a higher proportion of lower level qualifiers. So around 52% of the current stock of workers in the restaurants and hotels sector are qualified to NQF level 2 or below. So that sector will begin to again feel those pinches of fewer people exiting the education system post GCSE or post A level and entering the labour market as the education system continues to retain them for longer. And we really started to see that come through in the data, where in 2020 almost half of school leavers transitioned directly into higher education. So that's quite a significant volume of young people leaving school, entering directly to higher education. So that's not going to further education and then on to higher education, or leaving the post-primary education system and entering the labour market. So it is important, however, to recognise this is a short-term pressure for the labour market, particularly felt by those groups and businesses and sectors that rely on low-level qualifiers. But it's part of a long-term strategic vision, to develop and maintain a highly qualified and competitive local economy. The effects of this higher educational attainment have also been seen at further education, or particularly at further education, as this higher level of educational attainment allows more school leavers directly or to transition directly to higher education or return to school to complete A levels. That then means that the traditional education journey for lower level qualifiers moving into further education is diminishing. So it has reduced the number of people available for non-university courses, which again is felt particularly in further education. So if we looked at the numbers they're qualifying from further education at NQF level 2 and below, which is your A levels and below, in 2012-13 there was 28,000 qualifiers at that level of education, and in 2019-20 that was down to just 14,000 qualifiers. So it's halved over that period of 2012 to 2019. At the same time, a record number of qualifications were gained at higher education institutions. So if your sector relies on individuals coming out of further education or qualifiers from further education, again, it's going to start seeing these pinches in the number or the volume of available labour or qualifiers as we start to see the numbers declining here. Demographics isn't on our side. We've discussed that, but not all labour supply are new young entrants to the labour market. And it's important that we recognise that it's not all about school leavers, further education leavers and higher education institution leavers. It is important to recognise that your workforce and your potential labour supply should and can be quite diverse. So the first thing I want to look at is the potential labour supply from job to job movers. This represents a large part of labour supply. Increasingly, our workers are thought to have more than one career throughout their lifetime, as opposed maybe to having 2 or 3 careers, as opposed to getting into one career at a young age and staying in that career for maybe 30 or 40 years. there is an increasing idea that workers will now jump between different careers. So this idea of job-to-job movers is becoming increasingly important. And it's important that businesses recognise that individuals in different occupations, individuals in different sectors are potential workers for the hospitality and tourism industry. So ensuring that your sector is both attractive to a broad, and promoting your sector to a broad audience is really, really important in order to kind of capture that potential labour supply among job-to-job movers. The next group of potential labour supply that's going to become increasingly important over the next couple of decades are older workers. So we spoke about the slowing growth in the working age population and how that's expected to continue over the next decade. The slowing growth then results in a higher proportion of older individuals within our demography, and therefore older workers become increasingly important in terms of our labour supply as we move forward. And so if businesses are to diversify their workforce and really look at non-traditional recruitment strategies or non-traditional recruitment pools of labour, older workers are going to be one of those key groups. So it's important for businesses then to understand what are the needs of older workers. And if we look at what attracts an older worker to a sector, or what encourages an older worker to remain within a sector, older workers typically report that they go to work for social reasons. Again, the hospitality and tourism sector, a perfect sector in terms of socialising as a worker. They go to work for meaning. They like to ensure that when they're getting up and going out to work in the morning, it does have meaning, it has flexibility. So these things that are maybe more associated with older workers then become important for the sector, again, to promote as part of a wider, diverse, inclusive workforce that's being promoted. And then, of course, we have the economically inactive population that I discussed earlier. Again, there are different groups within the inactive population. Each, as I mentioned, come with complex needs and barriers. And this population will really be a population for policy, businesses and government to work together on mobilising, but just even recognising that to begin with, there's a subgroup within that population that represents about 52,000 people that report they would like to work. That represents a large volume of labour reserves. So really understanding who those individuals are. Is it mothers with caring responsibilities, and how can your business or sector promote itself as flexible and a bit more non-traditional in terms of working around the needs of those individuals? Is it individuals with caring responsibilities, something that's going to become even more predominant as our population continues to age? More people are expected to have more caring responsibilities. What are the needs for those individuals with caring responsibilities? Maybe it is working closer to home. Maybe it is that level of flexibility. So it's about understanding non-traditional pools of labour reserves over the next, I suppose, 5, 10, 15 years moving forward, and trying to understand how your business can adapt to suit the needs of some of these individuals that could form part of a more diverse workforce. Finally then, looking forward in the Northern Ireland labour market, the Northern Ireland Skills Barometer forecasts future skills demand and supply imbalances that are expected over the coming decade. And this is a chart that I've lifted from the Northern Ireland Skills Barometer just to highlight where the pinch points are expected to be going forward. So if we start at the bottom of this chart, we can see that there's expected to be a marginal oversupply at NQF level 2 and below. And that is, we expect there to be too many individuals coming out of the education system with those levels of qualification. However, it's important to recognise these trends these imbalances are based at looking at long-term historic trends in attainment and enrolment patterns. But if the patterns of 2020 alone were to be maintained over the next 10-year period, there really is a risk that both level 2 and below level 2 may become undersupplied also, as we have seen such a huge reduction in the most recent year. So they are expected to be oversupplied over the next 10 years, but if the most recent trends in just the most recent year were to be continued or maintained, we might see those shift into an undersupply. At NQF level 3, the undersupply of qualifiers is expected to be the most acute, as discussed for many reasons throughout the presentation, followed by NQF level 4 and 5. And these are the traditional qualifications that are delivered at further education. Again, as the educational attainment continues to increase and individuals are retained in the education system for longer, more young people are moving directly into higher education. These pinch points are really going to be at NQF level 3 and NQF level 4, 5 going forward. It's also expected to continue into NQF level 6, which is your undergraduates, your master's level and PhD level qualifiers. However, it's important to note here that at this higher level of qualification, it's assumed that not all qualifiers with NQF level 6 qualifications will have the necessary experience and wider employability to successfully access job opportunities within high-skilled occupations. So at NQF level 6 and above, there is an adjustment made to reflect that many NQF level 6 qualifiers won't take an NQF level 6 job. So that volume of undersupply can be reduced not by increasing the supply to that level of qualification, but actually by employing strategies to improve employability among those qualifiers that are already coming out at NQF level 6+, and ensuring that they have those employability skills and that wider experience to all gain jobs at NQF level 6 and above, to which they are qualified. Finally, then, what's next for recruitment, and particularly within the hospitality and tourism sector? So the key theme here is going to be around, well, how can the sector access workers and how can it retain workers? And I've sort of pulled these together into three key themes. The first one is really around diversity and ensuring that you have a diverse workforce. And that comes in a range of different ways. It's about having a diverse range of qualifications. And these will link through as we move through and do engage and promote. A diverse range of qualifications means having individuals with lower levels of qualifications, means having individuals with professional and technical qualifications and higher level qualifications right throughout your workforce and right throughout your sector. It's going to be particularly important over the next decade to really promote yourself as having a diverse range of workers, that you are a sector that employs older workers. You're a sector that's been able to mobilise some of the economically inactive population, whether those are caregivers, whether those are mothers with children, whether those are individuals who face long-term sickness problems. And then another thing is around work experience opportunities, which I didn't touch on within the presentation, but again, ensuring that businesses can present or promote opportunities for a diverse range of work experience opportunities is going to be vitally important going forward. And a diverse range of work experience opportunities could be anything from a week's work experience within a particular business or across a particular sector. It could be a summer internship, or it could be a year-long opportunity. And those work experience opportunities are going to be key in terms of attracting young people to the sector and then retaining young people within the sector if they've had that experience of exposure to the sector. The next thing we want to look at is engagement in terms of accessing and retaining your workers. It is going to be important to engage with the education system, whether that's on course development opportunities or qualification development moving forward, and ensuring that the courses that are developed or the new qualifications that are developed over the next decade align to the needs of your sector, align to the needs of your businesses. So take up those opportunities to engage with the likes of further education or higher education, or indeed post-primary, in the development of courses, the development of curriculum, because the better aligned they are for industry, the easier or smoother the transition from the education system to the world of work becomes. Again, in terms of the education system, and this is vitally important in terms of work experience opportunities, it's about developing good work experience opportunities. It isn't enough to just bring young people in and sit them at a desk and have them do a couple of different tasks a day, or have them out on the floor. It's about developing a pattern, developing a work stream for them when they're in on work experience, whether that's for a day a week, whether that's a full week, or whether that's a full year. Really developing what represents a good opportunity. How can these young people be exposed to the sector and get the most out of the sector whilst they're on work experience? And then finally, in terms of engagement, it's going to be very important to engage with the out of work community, whether that is individuals who are quite close to the labour market, which we would call the unemployed population, or that inactive group that I talked about that report they would like to work, or the broader inactive population. It's going to be vitally important, particularly among that inactive group, to really understand what are their needs and requirements. Can my business adapt to some of those needs that they have? How can I move away maybe from some of the non-traditional or some of the traditional structures of recruitment of these people who are out of work? And can that suit my business? Finally, then, in terms of promotion, which the sector does very well, and I've seen the recent promotion of the hospitality and tourism sector in the most recent campaigns, it is all about promoting the sector to young people from an early age, and that can be done through that engagement with the education system and through developing those good work experience opportunities. But it's also about promoting the sector to a broader audience and attracting those job-to-job movers, which will become increasingly important as the pool of young people is squeezed over the coming decades. And finally, then, just reiterating that promotion of the sector as a diverse and inclusive sector in order to retain and gain workers. And that's the idea that you can promote yourself as a sector that is able to employ older workers, that's able to employ disabled workers, that's able to employ individuals that have caring needs, and the sector is flexible enough to do so. So those are the kind of three key themes that I would pull together in terms of accessing workers, retaining workers, and recruitment over the coming decade. So thank you very much for listening. And if you have any questions at all around the presentation, or would like to delve deeper into any of the indicators that were discussed or any of the topics that were discussed, please feel free to get in contact with my details that are on the screen now. Thank you.
Thanks, Margaret. Certainly thank you for making sense of the stats for us. A really insightful overview of the current labour market and indeed the implications for recruitment. You know, as you've noted, the impact of COVID and Brexit is being felt in the sector. We know it's a very tight labour market. There's strong competition for available talent across many sectors. And that requires some fresh thinking about who and how we target potential job seekers, including the economically inactive. I'm sure we're not the only sector who would like a slice of that 52,000 people who you note as being close to the labour market. So it's really helpful in terms of your presentation, begin to think about how we as a sector and indeed individual employers might, with partners, look at how we're targeting some of the available and non-traditional labour pools as part of sector attraction and recruitment strategies going forward, and how we can achieve stand out in the job market as a sector. I know certainly there have been some successful recruitment initiatives such as academies and boot camps which are being delivered at the moment, and that's an area that I think we have an opportunity to explore further on a sector with the support of some partner organisations, with some customisation for some of the key groups that you note in terms of career changers, etc. So it's one of the other areas that I thought as well that came out to me loud and clear as well is opportunities for the sector around perhaps promoting higher level apprenticeships so that we can progress people in training alongside their career ambitions, but at the same time support them with employment in the workplace. So again, these are areas that we'd look at on a sector basis going forward. So your presentation certainly gives us much insight and lends much food for thought on that front for us going forward. So thank you for that, Marguerite. So just finally, in bringing the session to a close, I'd also like to thank Tourism NI in supporting us to deliver this webinar series, and to all of you, thank you for attending. I hope you've gained value and insight from the webinar, and that you've got some of the key takeaways from the themes that Marguerite has touched on around diversification, engagement and promotion. And that you'll join us for some of the other webinars in the series, some of which actually build on from this particular one to touch on best practice in recruitment and direct signposts to delivery partners who work with young people, who work with the non-traditional labour pools that Marguerite has referenced, and also supporting work experience opportunities for employers to connect with schools, which again is vital in terms of helping to build that strong talent pipeline for the future. So you'll find details for the rest of the webinar series on the webpage hatsnetwork.co.uk, and we look forward to you joining us again soon. Thank you very much.